Hello and welcome to another series on contemporary Western philosophy. And today we'll take a look at idealism. So let's try to understand what is idealism and how do we use it in our everyday life. So, first and foremost, let's begin by defining the terms. Now, here we'll see what are the terms that we use in our everyday life, as well as how idealism or what idealism means in philosophy. So, first and foremost, we see that when we speak in terms of everyday life, sometimes we refer to terms like, okay, a person has ideals or he lives by ideals. So, we see that ideals are kind of values that people tend to hold. Okay, certain things like principles, qualities which people hold dear to themselves or they strive to live by them. Okay, so we see that certain principles like honesty, compassion and justice. And therefore, for example, a person who dreams of creating a better world will follow these things, these qualities like honesty, compassion, justice, and thus he will try by his own self, by his example, to make the world a better place. On the other hand, when we look at philosophy, here we see that idealism is the belief that reality in its essence is made up of ideas rather than material objects. So a famous phrase which in a way captures this idea is this one, that the idea is the real and the real is the idea. So what does this mean? In simple terms, if we have to explain this in one line, we can say that what we perceive around us is ultimately the product of our mind as well as consciousness. But let's take a deeper look at this. Let's take a look at what this phrase, the idea is the real and the real is the idea, actually means. So this in a way suggests that all our ideas, thoughts or perceptions are in a way inseparable from reality. And it's all about understanding and looking at how we interpret things and how we understand certain things in our lives. So first and foremost, here you have reality as ideas, which basically refers to the fact that our perception of reality is influenced by our ideas and our thoughts. For example, when we see an apple, okay, so the whole concept of apple will indicate its color, shape and taste, among other things. And therefore, when we see an apple, this whole aspect of color, shape and taste is an idea that is formed in our mind, and hence this idea then becomes a reality. So when we look at an orange, we will not call it an apple. Why? Because the color, the shape, taste is different. Next, we see that ideas also shape reality. So our thoughts and beliefs can also influence how we experience and how we interact with the world. So for example, if we believe that hard work leads to success, then we see that this idea will motivate us to work hard and it will make this a reality in our lives. So that means we work hard, we put in more effort, and ultimately it will bear success. Now let's take a look at the comparison or the contrast between materialism and idealism, because we see that idealism can be better understood by contrasting it with materialism and then by comparing idealism to rationalism and empiricism. So first let us contrast it. So when we look at materialism, so materialism basically believes that the reality is made up of physical matter, okay, like atoms and molecules. So, and therefore everything we see is as a result of this material interactions. So for example, a chair is simply wood as well as nails, but we see that it is built through a physical process. So therefore it is the nails, the wood, that is interacting in order to make the chair. Now idealism, on the other hand, will believe that what we perceive, that is the chair, is ultimately an idea, or it is a kind of a mental construct. So here we look at the concept of the chairness. Now this chairness exists in our mind. If you look at a bed, we will not say that it is a chair. Why? Because we have a certain idea of a chair in our mind. A chair should look like this, and therefore this perception gives meaning to this physical form that is there. Now let's take a look at rationalism and empirism. Now rationalism says that knowledge comes primarily from reasoning and ideas, and not from senses. And therefore idealism in a way closely aligns with rationalism, because both, that is rationalism as well as idealism, will prioritize mind over sensory experience. Now let's take a example of a triangle. Now knowing that all the angles of the triangle add up to 180 degrees is a product of reason. It is not something that we can see directly. Next, let us contrast idealism with empiricism. So here we see that empiricism believes that knowledge comes directly from sensory experience. So this often leads to materialism. Why? Because since sensory perception connects us to the physical objects. Okay, so for example, we know the apple is red because we can see it. We can see it through our senses, through the eyes. Now let's take a look at the origins of idealism. So let's kind of have an in-depth exploration of this. So Plato, we see that, laid the groundwork for idealism. He did this by emphasizing the separation between two levels of reality, that is the world of ideas and the physical world. Now according to Plato, ideas or forms are eternal, perfect and unchanging. They represent the true reality. For example, the idea of a circle in mathematics is flawless, and we see that this in a way exists beyond time and space, and therefore we see that this ideal circle can never be replicated in the physical world, but we see that still it serves as a standard by which all other circles are understood as well as drawn. And therefore we see that these forms in a way are not dependent on human perception. They exist independently as universal truths. When we look at concepts such as justice or goodness or beauty, they remain constant regardless of how individuals perceive them. Now the next concept of Plato is the physical world, that is the material world. How we perceive it through our senses is transient, imperfect and constantly changing. And for Plato, as we know, this world is a mere shadow or an imitation of the perfect realm of forms. For example, any object we call beautiful, for example, a painting or a person or a flower, it's only a reflection of the perfect and eternal form of beauty that exists in the world of ideas. Now, example for this can be looking at various chairs in the real world. Now, when we look at these chairs, what we see? So, for example, chair 1, 2, 3 and 4. We see that all these chairs differ in size, color, material as well as design. But all of these are identified as chairs. Why? Because they share something in common. That is, their participation in the universal idea of chairness. And therefore, Plato would argue that this idea of chairness is real, it is eternal, and it is unchanging. While the physical chairs, what we see, are temporary and flawed in imitations. And therefore, we see that Plato's philosophy encourages us to value the realm of ideas over the physical world. And therefore, for idealists, this means recognizing that what is eternal and unchanging constitutes the ultimate reality, while the material world is in a way secondary and illusionary. Now, let's take a look at René Descartes. So, Descartes introduced the bridge problem, that is a key step which we can say in the evolution of the idealist thought. So, here he brings about two concepts. One is mind dependent knowledge and the other one is the bridge problem. So, Descartes argued that we do not directly perceive objects in the external world. Instead, what we know are the ideas or representations of those objects in our minds. Let's take for example a tree. Now, when you look at a tree, what you perceive is not the tree itself, but your mind's idea, or what we call as a mental image of the tree. And therefore, in a way, this raises the question, how can we be certain that the mental image corresponds to the actual tree? Okay, we can think and discuss about this. How can we be sure that this mental image of the tree corresponds to the actual tree? Or can the whole concept of tree be something completely different? Next, we come to the bridge problem. Now, the main issue that Descartes faced was how to connect our internal ideas to external reality. Now, if we only know the ideas in our mind, how can we be sure that they reflect the real world? I have an idea of a tree. How can I be sure that my idea of the tree is the tree that is there in front? And therefore, we see that this challenge is like standing on one side of the river and trying to cross over this river, going to the other side, but without a bridge. And therefore, in this way, we see that here Descartes asserted that the only things we can be absolutely certain of are the ideas in our own mind. And therefore, this is encapsulated in his statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But we see that the tricky part in connecting these internal ideas to the external world is how can we trust that our mental representations accurately mirror the world that is there outside our minds. Now, when we look at this bridge problem, now in a way we may say, how is it possible? And here Descartes introduces the concept of a benevolent God who would not deceive us. And thereby he assures us that our clear and distinct perceptions can be trusted to reflect the reality. Nonetheless, we see that this still leaves a lot of philosophical questions about the nature of reality and our ability to know that this concept itself is certain. And therefore, Descartes' focus on ideas as the primary objects of knowledge reinforced the notion that the mind plays a fundamental role in constructing reality. Although Descartes did not fully embrace idealism, his emphasis on the mind paved the way for later thinkers like Kant to deepen idealist theories. Next, we go to Fichte. So, in a way, we see that Fichte took Kant's ideas further and introduced a radical version of idealism, which we will see in the days to come. So, here he focuses firstly on subject-centered reality. So, Fichte rejected the notion of an external world independent of the mind. So, he argued that the mind creates everything that we perceive, and in his view, what we call as reality is entirely a product of consciousness. For example, when you see a mountain, Fichte would say that the mountain exists because your mind is constructing it as a part of your experience. Without the mind, there would be no mountain. Next, he speaks about the infinite subject. So here, this infinite subject, according to him, refers to an universal or absolute consciousness. Therefore, all reality, according to Fichte, is the unfolding of this infinite subject. Let's take a look at this in a little bit detail. So, first and foremost, Fichte says that the subject is a source of reality. So, for Fichte, there is no external reality that is separate from the subject. Instead, reality is the product of the mind. So, the infinite subject represents an all-encompassing and universal consciousness which generates the world and everything within it. He also speaks about the unfolding of reality. So, Fichte compares reality to a process of self-expression or development of this infinite consciousness. For example, when we look at the seed, we see that the seed contains the potential to become a tree. And therefore, this infinite subject contains the potential of all the experiences and objects of the world. For example, the seed contains all the things that are there or we can find in a tree. So, these emerge and unfold over time through the activities of consciousness. And therefore, Fichte says that human consciousness is part of the infinite subject. So, he says that the individual human consciousness is a limited manifestation of the infinite subject. And therefore, every person's thoughts, experiences, and understanding contribute to the universal reality. He also says that reality is dynamic, not static. So, we see that the infinite subject is not a fixed entity. It is active, constantly creating and shaping our reality. And therefore, this reflects in a way Fichte's belief in the primacy of action and the idea that reality is an ongoing process of becoming. So, for example, when we think of a painter creating a landscape, we see that the objects in the painting exist only because the painter imagines and paints them. Similarly, Fichte believed that the world exists only because the infinite subject imagines it into being. And therefore, his view eliminates the need for an external reality. For him, there is no thing in itself that is beyond the mind. Reality is entirely constructed by consciousness, and therefore, this makes idealism a complete and self-contained system. Now, what examples from our daily life can we find idealism in? So we see that idealism is a philosophy that emphasizes the role of the mind in shaping reality. And here are certain concepts that in a way illustrate idealism in our daily world. So we have dreams and reality, virtual reality, and also art, drawing, painting, etc. So first and foremost, let's take a look at dreams and reality. So when we dream, everything seems vivid and real, right? So people, places, events. However, when we wake up, we realize that the entire experience only existed in our mind. And here we see that idealism uses this analogy for waking life. It suggests that our everyday experiences might also be mental constructs that are shaped by our perception, rather than an objective reality that is independent of our minds. Now let's take an example. Imagine you're dreaming about walking in a park. You see the trees, you hear the birds, and you also feel the cool breeze that is blowing on your skin. While dreaming, it feels real. Now, let us consider real life, or what we call as the waking life. Now, when you walk in the park, an idealist would argue that your experience, that is the sight of the trees, the sound of the birds, and also the sensation of the breeze, is also mediated by your mind. You are not directly experiencing the park, but it is your mind's interpretation of it. Next, let's take a look at virtual reality. Now, virtual reality, as we know, is a modern technological example of idealism. When you wear virtual reality goggles, you interact with a digital environment, and therefore the objects and spaces in virtual reality do not exist physically. They are purely virtual, created by computer code, but experienced as real in your mind. And therefore idealism extends this idea to everyday reality, arguing that even without virtual reality goggles, a perception of the world is a mental construct shaped by the mind's ideas. So for example, when you play virtual reality game, when you're exploring, for example, an underwater world, you see the fish swimming, you see the coral reefs, and you can even touch objects by using haptic feedback devices. Now in reality, none of these objects exist physically. They are digital constructs experienced through your mind. And therefore similarly, idealists will also suggest that our perception of the physical world operates like this. The reality we experience is a projection shaped by our mind's ideas. And next we take a look at art. Art is another example where we see that reality of an object, for example a painting, goes beyond its physical existence. So the physical painting is just paint as we see on the canvas, but its deeper meaning or emotional impact comes from how we interpret it. Now idealists argue that the mental interpretation is the painting's reality. So what you experience is not the physical materials, but the ideas and emotions that physical piece of cloth or that canvas is in a way evoking within you. Let's take an example of Van Gogh's Starry Night. As you can see here, to one person it may evoke feelings of tranquility and hope. For somebody else, this can also indicate chaos. Okay, everything is like blur, everything is like kind of chaos. For some also it can indicate loneliness. And therefore we see that the painting's reality isn't in the paint or in the canvas. It is how it is experienced by the mind. And therefore an idealist would argue that this mental interaction is the painting's true essence. And this demonstrates how reality is constructed by us. And therefore, these examples which we have seen show how idealism works in everyday context. For example, dream reveals how the mind creates vivid experiences that feel real, suggesting that the waking life might be similarly shaped by our mental constructs. Virtual reality demonstrates how technology can create immersive environments that feel real but are entirely mind dependent. And therefore, this in a way mirrors the idealist view of our everyday perception. Art and painting also highlights how reality is not just about physical existence but about meanings and emotions which are created by our mind's interpretation. And therefore, in each case, we see that idealism leads us to the idea that reality is shaped by the mind and its essence lies in ideas, not in physical objects. And therefore, as we wind up, we can ask ourselves, can you find examples from everyday life that reveals reality is shaped by our mind and its essence lies in ideas, not in physical objects? Can we think of some of these examples? Well, if you do think, do mention it in the comment section. We can take a look at it in the next class. Thank you and see you next time.